Just this year, the Criterion Channel released a theme collection that showcases 25 films from the Sundance Film Festival class of 1992, which is probably known as the pinnacle year of indie filmmaking. The fairly large collection features 25 films with a pretty diverse set of directors and stories that voyage through very different experiences. The grassroots festival during the time marked a starting point for an influx of film waves such as the new queer cinema, which I happened to cover in a last episode, while it also jump-started many careers for big commercial actors and directors alike. As the equipment became increasingly accessible for a new generation of filmmakers, independent filmmaking rose in the US, offering a platform and creating a market for marginalized creatives. This transformative era of American cinema, influenced largely by the conservative political regime that many filmmakers are responding to through their stories of rage and recollection. In this list, I'll be sorting through and ranking all 25 films and narrowing down Criterion Channel's Sundance 1992's best works. Beginning at number 25, Poison Ivy launches its way into Sundance, perhaps by accident. Immediately, we're introduced to its prominent appeal, a young Drew Barrymore, who is unfortunately in a time too early in her career to execute a performance. Her best friend, played by Sarah Gilbert, provides a narration which can be described as a self-righteous, angry white feminist, and lacks decent writing. Its storyline is inconsistent and relies heavily on sexualizing an underage Barrymore with her much older castmates. Johnny Suede is guilty of similar fallacies. The story's structure feels very removed and fragmented, which makes it very difficult to establish a connection to Pitt's character. I found myself trying to find distraction in the direction of photography, but his creativity proved absent. Unfortunately, up until the end, Suede remains stagnant as only a naive and delusional failing rock star.
Try to be a little more careful because I hate to say it, but there are guys around here who would like to do a lot more than look up your dress.
The hours and times follows the events that unfold when John Lennon, played by Ian Hart, and manager Brian Epstein, played by David Angus, take a 4-day getaway trip to Barcelona in 1963. Most salient in the black and white fictionalized biography is the film's unmemorable performances by its lead cast. An odd chemistry between the two builds itself into an anticlimactic demise that doesn't seem to provide much substance. The story suggests that Epstein and Lennon shared a homoerotic relationship during the vacation trip that was kept secret amongst peers and fans. However, it refuses to complicate itself more. Jim Jarmusch's Night on Earth is a film meant to develop a striking string of story through its juxtaposition in culture and language. It follows a series of 5 sketches set in 5 different cities simultaneously, bonded by the relationship between a taxi driver and its passenger. The progression in this film grows incrementally slow with no substantial payoff, just as the characterization begins to peel away, layer by layer, unveiling a vulnerability that Jarmusch initially intended to capture. Their story has ended and cuts to a new set of characters. Inevitably, Night on Earth captures no rhythmic feel that was meant to be achieved in this style of writing. In this drama, starring Helen Hunt, Wesley Snipes, and Eric Stoltz, a recently paralyzed writer finds himself in a rehabilitation center and learning to adjust himself to a new life. The water dance begins as an intimate outlook into the experiences of living with a mobile disability, narrated by main character Joel, played by Stoltz. However, the story spends too much time devoting itself to Joel's roommate's sub-dilemmas, which unfortunately congest the film with nuances and stories that run flat and one-dimensional. These hindrances in the water dance's integral components is overshadowed by its Sundance counterparts. Errol Morris's A Brief History in Time seeks to understand the life and work of Stephen Hawking, and by doing so, attempts to produce a voyeuristic journey of the cosmos. However, we find the experimental picture struggles to develop a memorable experience. The film is partly narrated by Hawking himself, and these are the sequences that felt the most intriguing and honest. He goes into detail about his daily experiences living with his ALS disability, and how it's shaped the scope of his theoretical research of the observable and non-observable universe. Unfortunately, it's difficult to avoid the very awful graphics that were animated to accompany the testimonials. A Brief History in Time lacked a visually dynamic exploration and a sense of coherence that would have made the film feel much smoother. Gregg Araki's The Living End is certainly a focal point on the list. Considered a prominent extension of the new queer cinema movement, this film devotes itself as a cultural artifact of the times when the AIDS epidemic was at an all-time high. The story follows fugitive gay lovers who are polar opposites in character, but sentimentally linked by their HIV-positive status that ignites a flame within them both. The Living End begins with potential and its vivid storytelling that reflects its times and a cast of raunchy misfits reminiscent of John Waters' characters in his 1974 art film Female Trouble. It's refreshing to see a precursor of new queer cinema that revived an anarchic structure in filmmaking. What I usually look for in Iraqi movies are the saturated color palettes and its color grading, and its visually dynamic set designs. However, The Living End shied away from both. It ends with the breathtaking shot that horizons a strong potential for cultivation of a tourism in Iraqi's bizarre world. Gas Food Lodging resembles a series of landscape paintings that are breathtaking and exudes a vastness of isolated space that the viewer is reminded of so often. Main character and narrator Shade lives in a lower-class truck stop town with her single mother and rebelliously misunderstood older sister. The young and naive Shade believes from watching traditional old Spanish films that the only way her dysfunctional small family can survive in their debilitating conditions is with the integration of a patriarch figure.
Yeah, I get lonely. I do, so big deal. Women are lonely in the 90s. It's our new phase. We'll live. I've been lonelier.
Gas Food Lodging is very reminiscent of the 80s damsel in distress movies. However, it offers a story that is very realistic and gritty, and takes place in a small world with many passing visitors. It proves to be a bold narrative that needed a bit more reworking in terms of writing and garnering a consistently promising trio of acts. Many commercially successful actors who have had early emergences in Sundance films had rough performances, though in rare instances, like Paul Schrader's Light Sleeper, actors like Willem Dafoe and Sarah Sarandon prove otherwise. Dafoe understands the tourism man stuck in a cocoon he cannot escape from. His performance is chilling and definitely the film's highlight. The manic sense of insomnia could have been elevated, which was in part because of writing. The film captures the practical scope of New York City's bustling and evolving drug trade business, and offers a neo-noir approach that works well, but could have been enhanced much more. Derek Jarman's Edward II plays like a moving avant-garde picture that maintains an integrity to storytelling and detail. The story follows King Edward II, the monarch of England and Lord of Ireland, played by Steve Wadington, who is openly gay and amored with notoriously wanted Piers Gaveston, played by Andrew Tiernan. The story takes place in the 1300s despite its ambiguous timeline that's mainly conveyed through costume design. Many of the characters' wardrobes span from different eras and culture, expanding the film's form and virtue. As the story climaxes, Wadington's portrayal of King Edward remains very amateur without any unique or daring takes on the significant character. There's a lot to admire about the cult cartoonist Bill Plimpton's Zatoon, which is characterized by its hypnotically playful and abstract nature. The story follows Dell, who's a young songwriter and must compose a hit song or risk getting fired by corporate order from his boss, Mr. Mega. Dell's sole inspiration for music is garnered by his intense love for Mr. Mega's assistant, Dee Dee. This animated feature is very sketch-like, which allows its shots to appear as standalone illustrations, and this unquestionably works in its favor. Plimpton is able to integrate advanced technical skill and animation with a story that opens itself to an endless sprouts of imagination. Filmmaker Alan Berliner captures a puzzling history of John Cassuto like a poetic letter of gratitude to him. The film plays like a compilation of memorabilia, home movies, scans, B-roll, and even artwork that facilitates a biographical story. Cassuto's long life is described by his socioeconomic impact in Japan after World War II, but questions his strained relationship with his family. Though Berliner doesn't seem to convince the viewer that he's capable of taking a step further in his documentation style. Berliner's interesting choice to conceal testimonial identities and exclusively rely on voiceover was a bit underwhelming. Its strong dependence ultimately feels like an endless montage, pulling away at the spectator's overall engagement. A charming and queer-led cast is embodied in Tom Kalin's Swoon, which is an experimental take on the Leopold and Loeb homicidal love story. The film is shot entirely in black and white, and the photography is reminiscent of erotic men's fashion photography, giving this adaptation its own look. The experimental approach integrated a plethora of distinctive styles and aesthetics that caters to the sleek and sensual neo-noir crime it is known for, and this was undeniably its strength. Therefore, it's easier to overlook its low-grade acting, especially from Loeb. Roddy Bogawa monochromatically captures the feverish moments after dark recollections surface in his docudrama style. Main character Ben discovers his father was a part of the bombing mission that killed his Japanese mother's village during World War II. He distills this grief and hurt through a poetically driven narrative. Its linear sequence of grief shifts into radical thought as he questions American imperialism's direct influence and the generational trauma that he's experiencing. Along the way, the spectator begins to get tangled in the dissolution between Ben and his white partner. One of the most profound films on this list is undoubtedly Finding Krista, produced and directed by Camille Billups and James Hatch. This starking documentary recounts an uncertain relationship between Billups and her daughter Krista, who she gave up for adoption when she was 4 years old. In a testimonial, an emotional Krista recalls her mother dropping her off at an orphanage. As an adult, Krista manages to find Billup and successfully contacts her, seeking to rebuild a relationship that may not even be possible. The film may be disturbing for many as it documents a deep look into child trauma and severe depression.
Told me to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, you were driving off. I think she sees me as an octopus, and I see her as a cactus, all spiny and untouchable.
There were many disagreements after the film's release between Krista, Billups, and Hatch. Finding Krista begs the question of analysis in the project's means of exploiting trauma and James Hatch's role in the producer of harm. This point was awkwardly and briefly discussed in the film, but it failed at maintaining the necessary transparency between the viewer and the filmmaker.
At that time, I told Camille, don't give Krista up for me.
As we move into the top 10, we begin to see stories that are more layered and more profound in detail and story. These movies are more definitive of the heart of the American independent film movement during that time. A bizarre tone is emphasized by a romantic-era French score in this short documenting an 18-day journey across the American South. Filmmakers Jeffrey Friedman and Rob Epstein evoke this whimsically bleak juxtaposition, overlaid with home video-style footage of rural and municipal communities. Friedman and Epstein set a simple objective: spontaneously capture a plethora of footage and interviews throughout their trek. Where Are We? A Trip Through America demonstrates that its many voices can be much more dynamic than a singular, refined narrative. By adopting this montage style, the film acts as a class examination of the South, and in doing so, the filmmakers open discourse on socio-political critique in a very organic manner. This mode of filmmaking transfigures the autonomy of documentary cinema. Essentially, the film is removed of frameworks that would otherwise prescribe its narratives and individual values. The most memorable scene was the evident distinction of class disparity, shown in real time through the casual testimonials of a local catfish restaurant owners and its workers.
What could be better for you?
More money. That's what could be better.
Mind if I ask how much you make?
Well, $3.45 an hour. But with the work you have to do, it's going to be more.
What was the most exciting moment of your life?
Oh, my goodness. When I went to Europe last September of 1990.
Jean-Pierre Gorin's My Crazy Life documents the gritty life of Samoan gang culture in Long Beach, California, without having to fully understand it himself. Though at times the film seems to blur the line between fiction, this eerily narrated documentary examines the struggles and unifying affinity within a community of gang members, and through this lens the film presents discourse on incarceration, the state of the police, family relations, and indigenous values. A narrative that can easily feel overwhelming, Gorin's storytelling effectively circumvents potential mistakes. A looming presence of law enforcement is stitched within the narrative, and the viewer is reminded of its inevitably violent hold on the community. Maria Novato's Danzón is definitely a standout, punctuating multiple integral elements, unlike many of its counterparts. First and foremost, its performances and chemistry amongst its cast, which is led by Maria Rojo, who plays Julia, an endearing and heart-driven damsel in distress. Julia and her dance partner Carmela have remained acquaintances for years, only bonded by Danzón, a style of dancing music historically popular in Cuba, and having had revivals in other parts of Latin America. It's not until Carmelo suddenly disappears without a trace, realizing this sudden departure has left her disoriented and heartbroken. In an act of love, Julia sets off to Veracruz in search of him, with only the name of his brother as the only clue on Carmelo's vague identity. Though Carmelo is the primary force in the story, his character feels like a ghost or an enigma, often as he's rarely portrayed. This works in favor, as it anchors at Julia's immense nervous breakdowns. The film explores dance and music as capable of bonding relationships and alleviating the soul from heartbreak. Danzón doesn't fail to remind the viewer of how this cultural revival of music influences the birthing of love and companionship.
Yo sé cuánto lo amabas, pero es preciso que lo olvides. Se ahogó. Ni modo, la vida es así. Y de que te ahogas, pues te ahogas, ¿no? Canelo está muerto.
Híjoles, qué cosas, ¿no? ¿Pero quién es Canelo?
¿Cómo que quién? Pues el hermano del charal.
Es que el que yo busco no se llama Canelo. Se llama Carmelo. Carmelo Benítez.
Lucille Cara's The Inland Sea is not interested in showcasing a typical story, but rather, Cara documents the peaks of gradual modernization and its effects in local communities that are self-sustained. Cara utilizes the year-long notes of the documented adventures of Donald Ritchie, an American expat who lived in the coastal island town of Seto, Japan, during the early 1970s. Throughout the film, many of Ritchie's intimate notes are recited verbatim, and it's a dynamic experience seeing how Cara translates these written memories into a vicarious story. This transition is rooted in philosophical empathy and is Cara's strength. Additionally, Cara interviews many of its locals, and the viewer catches glimpses of the modern daily tasks and struggles to sustain life and traditions in these coastal towns, serving as a reminder of the class structure as well as the resistance of vanishing traditions. The gorgeous cinematography offers a montage that is arrayed with poetic readings and lush undertones. The choice for film photography complements the rich vastness of the surrounding sea and the grand mountains. Ritchie's journal provides an intimate retelling of his relationships with local fishermen, merchants, and residents, as well as describing the subtle transition of seasons. The Inland Sea exercises a mesmerizing attention to the most mundane details that are fleeting, unfixed moments in time. Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Caro's dual creative vision is successfully integrated in their acutely crafted delicatessen. This French post-apocalyptic story centers the lives within a rundown apartment building run by butcher owner Clopet. Clopet murders and profits from human meat in efforts to continue running his meat market business, a direct reference to the title. He usually targets a handyman that are contracted for repairs in the building, until former circus clown Louison falls in love with his daughter Julie. Louison and Julie are faced with protecting their love, which inadvertently means bringing peace to the apartment building and its anxious tenants. The film feels like an auteur experience, given its many signature touches like its orange filtering and great emphasis on sound design. The performances all tailor campy and delirious personas are also notable qualities that prove to be the very heart of the film. Reaching the top 5, these pictures are pivotal narratives that also serve as some of my personal favorites. They provide more complicated and appropriated uses of cinema. With Worthy to commence the top 5, the unsettling and complex Brother's Keeper fosters a paradigm of resistance and individual freedom. The documentary takes place in a small rural town in New York named Munnsville that doesn't seem like a likely source of interest or attraction. The murder mystery documentary takes a private look at Delbert Ward, one of 4 brothers who farm inherited land and, having had no formal education, are illiterate. Nonetheless, the tight-knit brothers live private and comfortably. It isn't until the sudden puzzling death of William Ward that erupts an influx of mass media attention instantaneously commodifies the brothers in the subjectivity of death. Filmmakers Bruce Sinofsky and Joe Berliner consciously dissect these power relations and its ability to tarnish a community. One of the most alluring moments of nuance is a disclosure of William and Delbert's incestuous gay relationship and the mass media's response. There's a progression of resistance that converges the mobility of integration in the small town as we band together to combat the criminalization of Delbert.
I thank all my friends for all the support they gave me.
You ever know you had so many friends?
Not so many.
The camera work is prime amateur, which works in its favor by heightening the unsettling and intimate sequences, such as the prosecution.
I think the question is, Mr. Ward, we'll take a 10-minute recess. Jury may step aside.
Alexander Rockwell's dark comedy, shot in a high-contrasted black and white, provides stark insight into the complications between a manic film producer and an ego-driven failing screenwriter. The Criterion Channel offers a gorgeous 4K digital restoration that was supervised by Rockwell himself. In formal observation, the crossfade transitions are complementary to the story's dramatic and comedic cues, as well as its overall filmic look. The story is led by Gary Cooper, played by Steve Buscemi, who's an aspiring screenwriter and extremely passive. He comes across a firm believer of his vision, a sketchy mob mentality Joe who's set on producing his work. Their unlikely bond spirals into a living nightmare that impedes the production of the project. In the Soup exemplifies the building blocks of comedy when it appeals amongst every character. Buscemi flawlessly captures the miserably misfortunate lack of charisma to Gary that constitutes much of the troubles in the film. I really do enjoy this movie because it's self-aware as an independent art film, subjugating a liberatory element that allows the story to feel more free in form. Marlon Riggs is a strong contender to independent documentary filmmaking, and he proves to be so in his analytical color adjustment. In his critical documentary, Riggs surveys 40 years of black roles in American television history, and by doing so, he extends his radical dialogue. Narrated by Ruby Dee, the documentary features testimonials from black actors, producers, and scholars, which includes Esther Roll, Diane Carroll, Norman Lear, Alvin Poussaint, among others. The narrative sets out to destabilize the dominant television industry and dissects its practices of anti-blackness that was extremely blatant during the early era of television programming. Riggs understands the complex textuality produced by these landmark shows that are widely adopted by American pop culture, and in doing so, further complicates the way blackness has been commodified throughout television history. The point here is that television and film as an entity of commodity and a multinational industry is not inherently liberatory for non-white individuals. Color adjustment is an appropriate and necessary critical response, considering the technological boom during the time, and demonstrates how cinema has been utilized as an instrument of repression. Not so often is a melodic rhythm so inclined to facilitate thought as well as inspire new thought. Trinity Mina's Shoe for the Contents aims at documenting the artistic influences and political infrastructure in present-day China. The film recounts the Tiananmen massacre and the working class struggle, as well as critiquing US media intervention. Immediately, the viewer is introduced to Mina's keen style of filmmaking that emphasizes a macro observation rather than an individualistic narrative. Throughout the film, brief yet heavily informal introductions of individual stories and musical harmonies are layered and cut in a way that's meant to produce reflection. For example, during the sequences of testimonial and conversational dialogue, Mina will often cut directly following an introspective question. The film highlights this incompleteness and radicalizes itself by utilizing it as a tool to examine story, elements, and even musical value. This examination is responsible for producing self-reflective thought in the viewer while simultaneously challenging the Western format of storytelling. In relation to its placement in the Sundance Festival, Shoe for the Contents is substantial to understanding the impact of digital accessible media and independent filmmaking that became affordable for filmmakers across all class levels. The grassroots achievements of American independent cinema and its socio-political deconstruction is set forth in Michael Abded's Incident at Oglala. The acclaimed director's stunning work provides intensive material that has been utilized by a substantial degree of students and social activists and has been subject to responses by scholars and mass media. Robert Redford narrates this dramatic story that delves into the case of Leonard Peltier, who was convicted of murdering an FBI agent at a 1975 shootout on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. The shootout began as an investigation of stolen shoes that tragically took a violent turn, targeting A members. Of those killed was a member, Joe Stuntz, whose death prompted no legal action.
This is the worst outbreak of violence on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation since the 71-day siege at Wounded Knee 2 years ago. Police sources said the agents may have survived the initial gunfire, only to be executed later. Then there was another heavy exchange of fire. One Indian was shot dead. The rest of the Indians escaped.
The tragedy that occurred in the Pine Ridge Reservation transfigured into a historical marker that retraces the repeated assault and genocide against the Lakota Nation. In terms of cinematography choice, Apted experiments with eagle-eye shots that captures the landscape of the reservation. The documentary structure remains in the realm of traditional storytelling, but complicates it by involving a radical analysis by indigenous community activists and A members. Incident at Oglala documents a traumatic experience of anti-indigeneity in our time and furthering the criminalization of indigenous activists. Striding towards the third decade, Sundance 1992 selection sought many documented stories through different class levels, and this pointed towards a movement that circulated vastly and created its own market outside of the commercial film studios. These films serve as cinematic artifacts that must unavoidably become subject to analysis, particularly on how filmmakers revitalize film as a force just as much as an art form. And by its third decade, many of these films proved to be incredibly timeless.